Dr. Andrew Huberman is a renowned neuroscientist and associate professor of neurobiology and behavioral sciences at Stanford University.
One day I was walking with my dad and I asked him, what do you do for work? And he started to sort of explain. I said, and I'll never forget this, I said, does it feel good? And he said, yes, it's kind of like the feeling of the night before your birthday. And I said, well, then I'll study the brain.
We cover the profound impact of sunlight exposure on mental health and longevity.
Getting those minutes of sunlight exposure to the eyes is so important for mental health and physical health.
Along with ways to stop grey hairs from forming.
What causes the graying of hair with stress is that inside of that pocket, that niche, it releases a peroxide.
I'm Sarah Grynberg, and this is A Life of Greatness. Andrew, Time magazine last year printed an edition with you on the cover that said how Andrew Huberman got America to care about science. As a child, how did your love of science come about?
So as long as I can remember, I've loved animals and nature and biology. My father also happens to be a scientist. He's a physicist.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discussion of science and scientists in my home. And my mother is a writer, but has a deep appreciation for the natural world. So I was sort of immersed in it from an early age. And I love and loved animals of all kinds, including the human animal. So I would pass many hours as a young kid in aquarium stores, reading about fish, reading about different mammals. I was less interested, frankly, in extinct animals like dinosaurs and fantasy animals like dragons that I think a lot of young children are exposed to and interested in. And I was very interested in extant animals. And I delighted, and I still delight in kind of their specializations. So I loved the platypus, which is very relevant to folks down here. We don't have them in the States, but you have them down here because of their unusual combination of features, webbed feet, but mammalian, but electric sensing bill. I found it incredible. And so I found the diversity of animals incredible. And from a young age, I was supported in learning and thinking about science and the natural world. So my parents didn't get in my way on that. And I really can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in learning about live things. I was less interested in plants, although I love plants, but I found that animals and their unique abilities and humans to be super interesting. And so much so that I would pass a lot of my time reading the encyclopedia, reading the Guinness Book of World Records, anything and all things about animals. I wanted to own all of them, of course. I was highly disappointed I couldn't. And even though my dad was a scientist, we didn't spend that much time talking about physics. But there was one story, that a very brief story, I promise, that comes to mind where my dad, when I was about 6 years old, used to walk me to school. I would go about halfway, and then I would pick up another student, a young woman who lived across the street. She was a 6-year-old girl. And we would walk to the rest of the way to the cul-de-sac where the school was at the end of my street. And one day I was walking with my dad, and he would hang a left into this little pathway to his laboratory. He would walk to work. And I asked him, what do you do for work? And he started to sort of explain. And then I said, and I'll never forget this, I said, does it feel good? And he said, interesting. He said, yes, it's kind of like the feeling of the night before your birthday every single day. And I thought, well, that sounds great. And I have to credit him. I mean, what a great way to intrigue a child about a possible career path. And I said, well, then I want to do what you do. I want to be a physicist. And he said, no, I don't think you want to be a physicist because most of the great problems in physics are already worked out. You probably want to work on something where there's a bit more new information, more low-hanging fruit, if you will. And I said, well, what don't we know much about? And he said, well, we don't know a lot about the brain. So this would have been 1981. I was born in 75. And I said, well, then I'll study the brain. And so there was a path set in that discussion. We both remember that discussion. Wow. But then, of course, by the time I got to be 13, I hit puberty. There were a number of family challenges, a very unfortunately high conflict divorce, a lot of moving, a lot of chaos, frankly, that took me out of any kind of academic track or learning from about the age of 13 until the age of 19, when through a set of trials and tribulations, I did eventually make my way to university. And then it was in my second year of university that I reconnected with that love of learning science. And at that point, it was more or less survival because I had spent so many years not really functioning well in the classroom setting. But once I got back to that love of learning and I had a few excellent teachers, I was just like gas pedal all the way, learn, read, talk about it all the time. I knew I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to have a laboratory. And so the childhood seed of it took, there was a hiatus there, an important hiatus, but a challenging one. And then it's just been since 19, I'm 48 now, and that's pretty much all I do.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, when we have I suppose a dream as such when we're young. This is we know that that's what you want to be. From the age of 4, I just knew I wanted to work in entertainment. I just knew it. I watched The Wizard of Oz and it was it was sold for me. I just wanted to work in entertainment. And like you, I kind of did a roundabout, worked in marketing and PR and all this kind of jazz, but I always knew that my home was somewhere to do with entertainment. And I loved talking to people and it kind of formed naturally, but now it's you wouldn't look back. Every day I come and I do this job and it's the most nourishing thing I think I could do with myself. But I wonder, for people that have children, how do we allow them to keep that dream alive? I think so much of society tries to say oh, no, you can't do that. And I mean, being a scientist and doing that kind of work is looked upon as being, very high cred. But, I think there's something in that we should allow our kids to be able to dream big, because when they do, it's they're just, the rest of their life is completely different. They're doing stuff that they love. And we see so many people these days who are just in jobs that they just do not like. And then that we see the rates of depression and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I must say that the spark, that early feeling of delight in something that happens before we're thinking practically about, income or whether or not a particular job is considered an attractive job or an unattractive job. That's an important thing. And I think it's the feeling. It's the energy that's created in us when we think about certain things and that we first come into contact with when we're young, before we have all these filters up of judgment and what others are going to think. That's really critical. I think that while indeed being a scientist is considered a fairly respected profession by most, it is, to be honest, it's not a lucrative profession. Scientists are, often, I wouldn't say they struggle financially, but it's not a lucrative profession. It's not like law, business, or medicine.
Yeah.
It is really a sort of craft of deep love and desire to answer questions, to remain curious. And of course, there are exceptions to that. You have these, high-flying scientists that are patenting everything and, everything from drugs to devices and so it can be profitable for some people. But what we consider the quote-unquote card-carrying scientist is somebody that loves asking questions, that is willing to remain curious. And I define curiosity as a deep interest in knowing the answer without an attachment to what the answer is. I think it was Dorothy Parker who said, the cure to boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity,
I love
which I love. And I think I've always been curious about how things work, how we work, how other animals work. And that was the spark for me. I think if a child is exposed to a great number of different options and they are allowed to sort through that buffet, if you will, using their sensing their own energy about what they like and don't like, then one is in the best position to find those things. And I think for adults that are perhaps in a job they don't enjoy or a career track that doesn't feel right for them, I think if we spend a little bit of time thinking back to the things that we enjoyed when we were younger, before these filters come up around expectation, et cetera, that what we're looking for is not, okay, when I was a kid, I used to like to build sandcastles. Maybe I want to build sandcastles, but it's more about, well, what is it? Is it about creating little miniature landscapes of real life? It takes some introspection. So it's hard to apply kind of an across-the-board set of questions that if one asks, you ask these 10 questions, you'll find what your purpose. I don't think it works that way. I think that people have to sense into their own energetics, meaning their own, what gives them energy as opposed to what drains them. And even if we can't do those things as professionals and get paid for it, that there's great benefit to accessing those energy states as an adult. And you see this over and over in the realm of art, music, science, certainly medicine, that when somebody is well aligned with their career path, it's just a beautiful thing, and only good things can happen. And when we're not aligned with that, even in subtle ways, it really can drain our mental health. I've actually had the experience and the opportunity, for instance, I was offered a very, frankly, lucrative job in biotech. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting choice. Many faculty members in the university go to biotech. The Bay Area where I live is full of biotech companies, and the mission of this biotech company was quite noble. But for me, the idea of being in a cubicle and talking about the results of clinical trials and sort of and talking to lawyers about patents, like it lands me somewhere between wanting to take a nap and getting hives. Now, it's science, quote unquote. It's not that I don't think it's interesting. It's just not for me. And so I think one of the key things for anyone thinking about career or hobby or expanding on this notion of purpose is to imagine the daily life in that particular endeavor. This was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got when I was considering changing universities is, you think about the name of the university, you think about who your colleagues are going to be, you think about, sure, the salary, the benefits, because you have to be practical, but also think about, like, take oneself through a typical Wednesday at that place. What does it feel like to drive there? How's the parking? What does it feel like to go into the building? And in doing that, sensing into how it feels can inform a lot about whether or not it's the right choice or the wrong choice. And then the hard part is making that choice and trying to discard all those judgments, like, oh, well, that's the better university. Or that, several times in my career, I've left or moved from universities that were considered by everybody, the rankings and everybody, to be of higher, quote unquote, ranking for a slightly lower ranking university. But I did it because of a draw towards a particular set of people or circumstances. And in every single case, my productivity went up dramatically when following these kind of energetics. I may have a problem in that I can't stay in the wrong professional situation too long. And I feel like I'm almost drawn to certain professional situations that are right for me. Like, I never anticipate having a podcast, but at the end of 2020, Lex Friedman, who has a wonderful science and technology and culture podcast, made the suggestion to start a podcast. And within 3 weeks, we were buying cameras and setting something up. I sold my home. I moved to a rental. We set up, my producer, Rob Moore, and I set up in a closet and brought my bulldog with me, a 16-year-old kid who was an intern with me. And we released our first episode about a month later. And that was the first episode of the Huberman Lab podcast. So I have an almost compulsion towards what's right.
Yeah.
But it took a long time. And I made a lot of errors along the way of wrong turns, having to leave circumstances, and that was all uncomfortable. But I think for me, I just can't stay in the wrong professional situation. And I acknowledge that there are always practical constraints. One can't always do that. And at times it was scary. It was like, I remember my father, who's a scientist, saying when I was leaving a university voluntarily for what was considered a lower, quote unquote, lower caliber university, and he said, how many people are in the graduate class? And I said, 2. And he said, you're kidding me. And he said, well, either you're making the best decision of your life or you're destroying it all. And I thought, oh, well, no pressure. But in the end, 4 years later, we finished with, some great work done that I truly enjoyed.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think he was like, okay. And same thing with the podcast. I love my dad, but when I started the podcast, he's like, well, I don't know. How are people going to view this? You're doing this public facing stuff. And, and then within 6 months, he's like, well, I guess it was the right thing. So you have to be willing to, you have to be willing to take the risk and fail. And, but there it is.
My dad is a doctor, and he says the same thing when I started this podcast. He's like, so do you make money from podcasts?
Very practical.
Sarah, do you make money?
I think because no parent wants to see their child stricken or dependent. But I guess, the takeaway that I think I'm realizing right now is whatever brings out the best and greatest amount of energy.
Yes.
And when we're talking about energy, we're talking about neural energy, that it clearly relates to things like dopamine and norepinephrine, the things that get us into an activation state, that we have to have that because money, of course, is necessary for living. I always say, yes, money can't buy happiness, or I guess it should be no, money can't buy happiness, but money absolutely buffers against stress.
Yes.
To be honest, right?
Of course.
So anyone who says differently probably has a lot of money. And so one needs to be practical, but if one zooms out, you realize that the most practical thing is to do the thing that gives you the most energy, provided it's benevolent and it contributes to society and your own sense of well-being. Well, that's the thing that you're going to be able to do at the highest level, as opposed to something else that, makes you feel like you want to take a nap or gives you hives.
Yeah.
There's just no way I could be successful in biotech. No way. Yeah. For more than a year, I'd probably end up physically sick.
Yes, well, that's the thing. I'd love to know, obviously, a lot of what you talk about is on a range of different scientific matters, but something that has been a love of yours and has educated a lot of people that I'd like to talk about is the importance of sunlight, and especially the morning sun. And obviously you've been in Australia for a couple of weeks now, and our sun it's got a bite to it, as I'm sure you've experienced.
It does have a bite. Yeah.
So compared to other places in the world, like you don't have to be out there for very long to be able to get burnt and this and that. But a lot of Aussies experience, like we've all had like slip, slop, slap, which is the slogan about like putting a lot of sunscreen on. And, it's been, a lot about skin cancer and things like that. And there's a lot of research that talks to different things to do with sunscreen, to do with when you should be out getting sun. I'd love to know your views on that, on sunscreen.
Great.
Especially being in Australia as well.
Yeah. Well, first off, I do consider light and sunlight in particular to be one of the 6 key pillars of mental health and physical health. The others, just very quickly, are sleep, nutrition, exercise / movement, right? Relationships, including relationship to self, social interactions and relationship to self are so key. Stress control, or having some means to regulate stress because stress is inevitable. And then light, and in particular sunlight, for a variety of reasons. We know that regular exposure to sunlight to the eyes, and I'll explain what I mean by regular, is essential for setting our so-called circadian rhythm, that is regular sleep-wake cycles, and that is absolutely essential for mental health. There's a beautiful study out of the UK that was published recently with over 86,000 subjects showing that the positive effects of getting sunlight, especially early in the day, on all aspects of mental health, in addition to suppressing certain symptoms of mental illness, because we don't want to confuse mental health and mental illness. And this is really key, getting dark exposure at night, right? We rarely think about the absence of light as a positive, but being in the dark or very dim light at night is absolutely essential for mental health. Essentially, more sunlight early in the day, provided one doesn't burn, we'll talk about burning and sunscreen, et cetera, or damage one's eyes, is great for mental health. The data show that. Everything from PTSD, depression, et cetera, the symptoms get better. They might not be cured, but get better when people are getting sunlight during the day, especially the morning, and in darkness at night. And if you think about what most people are doing nowadays, they don't tend to get enough sunlight during the morning. Then they go into environments where they're under artificial lights, thinking those lights are very bright, but they're actually far dimmer, far less photon energy than were they to just get a little bit of sunlight outside. And then at night, people are exposed to those same artificial lights and screens. But here's the diabolical thing. The neural retina, the portion of the eye that responds to light, it's actually a part of the brain that lines the back of your eye, is more sensitive to light at night, so it takes very little artificial light to disrupt these circadian rhythms, blood glucose regulation, et cetera. We can get into that more. So one of the 6 pillars of mental health, physical health, and performance is light and sunlight in particular, because we know from now hundreds of studies on humans that if humans get a little bit of sunlight in their eyes early in the day, when the sun is at what's called low solar angle, a couple of things are key. First of all, it sets in motion the circadian rhythm for elevated daytime mood, focus, and alertness, and enhanced immune system function. And it sets a timer on when one goes to sleep at night. So it's among the most important things that we can do. Now, on overcast days, it's especially important. And this is usually the portion of the conversation where a listener thinks, there's no sunlight where I live. Okay, I'm going to tell you, unless you live underground, there is always sunlight. There's always sunlight. And if you look at how bright it is on the worst stormy overcast day versus at night, guess what? It's a lot brighter outside. There's always sunlight. Now, when we say sunlight, people think the sun, the object, like you need to go see the sun, the object, but that's not the case. You need sunlight. You need the photon energy coming down through the sky, especially on cloudy days. I always say about 5 minutes to 10 minutes on a clear day, about 10 to 20 minutes on a partially overcast day, and as much as 30 minutes on an overcast day. Ideally, you get outside. You don't do this through a window. You don't wear sunglasses for this, provided you can do that safely. Contacts and corrective lenses, eyeglasses are fine. You face in the direction of the sun. If you're in the shade, it's not a big deal, but if you can get some sunlight in your eyes, provided that you blink to protect your eyes, you'll know when you need to blink because you don't want to stare at the sun. But I have to put all these caveats. Now, what does that do? What that does is it triggers the activation of a set of neurons in the eye called the intrinsically photosensitive melanopsin ganglion cells, which is just a bunch of science speak for the neurons that then communicate to an area of your brain called the hypothalamus, which then releases all these hormones and peptides into your system all day long and sets your melatonin rhythm for nighttime sleep. It is the most powerful stimulus for all of that stuff. No supplement, no food, no social engagement, no caffeine, no nothing can do all of that, as well as morning sunlight exposure. Now, if you miss a day, no big deal. But when do you do it? Well, when the sun is low in the sky, it has a couple of features that are really important. First of all, you'll notice on a clear day that there's a lot of yellow and kind of pink blue contrast when the sun is low in the sky, as opposed to when it's directly overhead, you just kind of see it as bright white light. Those color contrasts are the best stimulus for those cells in the back of the eye to do their thing. The other thing about low solar angle sunlight in the morning and the evening is that the UV index is very low. When the sun is low in the sky, you have very little risk of damaging your cornea, damaging your skin through sunburn. Just look at the sun early in the day and it's easier to look at for longer than when it's overhead. And there's a reason for that. There's some atmospheric interference when it's low in the sky, but also as you catch that morning first light and the sun rising, that is the primordial stimulus for waking up our system. Now, people always say, oh goodness, you're telling me I have to watch the sunrise? No, low solar angle means anytime before it's overhead. Now, if you're a teenager and you're waking up at 11 a.m., sun's already overhead, okay, you try and get a little sunlight in your eyes. But here's the deal. Getting those minutes of sunlight exposure to the eyes is so important for mental health and physical health. And again, sets in motion all sorts of positive things. But then people say, well, what about sunburn? Okay, well, the best way to avoid sunburn is to avoid bright sunlight exposure when the sun is directly overhead, sort of in the middle of the day. And by the way, getting sunlight exposure to your eyes in the middle of the day, while it can have some benefits on mood and hormone production by way of exposure to the skin, we'll talk about what's too much, what's too little. Your circadian rhythm, that is these mechanisms controlling sleep wakefulness, cannot be impacted by light during the middle of the day. It's called literally the circadian dead zone. You can't shift your circadian clock then, but morning sunlight is key and afternoon sunlight is key as well. Again, when the sun is lowering, you don't have to see it just sink behind the horizon. If you can, great, but if you don't, no big deal. Now, what about sunburn and what about sunscreen? I confess I want to just highlight this because on some previous discussions of this topic, I've had elements clipped out, and I've been misunderstood as thinking that sunscreen is not good for us, or maybe even bad for us. And I want to go on record. This is a wonderful opportunity to say, there is definitely a case for sunscreen. You do not want skin cancer. You do not want to burn. And the UV index is very high here in Australia. And as you pointed out, it has a bite to it. The sun has a bite. So I use sunscreen I will repeat, I use sunscreen. I do focus on using sunscreens that are basically where the only active ingredient is zinc oxide, because these the zinc oxide sunscreens, and by the way, I have no relationship to any sunscreen brand. I just happen to do that because most of the sunscreens that do have things in addition to zinc oxide, not all of them, but many of them, I should say, not most, many of them include things that are known to go transdermally through the skin, and that there are studies have shown that they may have some potential negative effects on other organs and systems of the body. And so given that there are excellent mineral-based sunscreens, I prefer to use those. Now, regardless of what type of sunscreen one feels safe using or not, I think it's worth mentioning that the best thing to prevent sunburn is a physical barrier. A long sleeve shirt that's kind of loose. This is known all over the world, especially in desert cultures, like a hat, right? A brimmed hat, if you will. It's fine to combine that with sunscreen if you need it, but one of the best ways to keep from burning is to not let the sun reach your skin, right? Through a physical barrier. And there's no debate about whether or not the physical barrier causes, potential ill effects of, there are some sunscreens with some nasty stuff in them. Now, how nasty and, whether or not it impacts things like fertility or whether or not they're pro-cancerous has been debated quite a bit. I'm of the mind that if one can make a clearly safe choice, why risk the potentially unsafe choice? Right? Especially given that the costs on these things tend to be pretty much equal. Yeah. And given that a physical barrier is zero cost, except you need the article of clothing, well, then that makes sense. Now, so I wear sunscreen, especially in the middle of the day. Here, I've been slathering it on. Yeah. I do think that it's worth noting that we do have a natural adaptation to sun exposure, which is the addition of some melanin to the skin, right? The melanocytes, the cells that cause some pigmentation, can either turn on or migrate when we get some sun exposure to the skin. And there's a very close relationship between sun exposure to the skin and the production of hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and dopamine, which is a neuromodulator. There's a brief anecdote in the landscape of natural biology that's relevant here. There are certain animals like the Arctic fox and other animals like that are, no surprise, they're white in the winter, and they happen to be darker in the summertime. So pelage color changes in certain animals by virtue of those same melanocytes being activated or suppressed in the presence or absence of the sun. We don't have hair. We have little hairs on us. They're remnants of when we were probably much hairier organisms. But when we get sunlight on our skin, there's the production of dopamine. Now, why would we say, okay, how's dopamine and pelage color and all this? Well, it turns out that the same gene pathway, there's an enzyme called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase, anytime you hear ASE, you're talking about an enzyme. The tyrosinase pathway is the pathway that's mutated in the albino mutation. In other words, the same pathways that control pigmentation of the skin and of pelage in animals that have fur is related to dopamine. Why? Tyrosine is the precursor to dopamine. So I'm throwing out a bunch of things here, but here's the takeaway. Getting a bit, not too much, but a bit of sun exposure to the skin in the middle of the day is known to elevate levels of dopamine. And dopamine is a neuromodulator. You can feel it. And it's known to elevate testosterone and estrogen in humans. And when people say, here, elevate testosterone and estrogen, usually what happens is, all the women worry, well, I don't want my testosterone too high. But guess what? In women, the levels of testosterone per deciliter are higher than levels of estrogen. They just so happen to be, on average, lower than the absolute levels of testosterone in men. So men and women both need testosterone and estrogen to, quote unquote, feel good, to feel vigorous. And when this was a beautiful study published in Cell Reports Medicine last year or the year before, perhaps, it was a study done in the Middle East where they had people go outside for about 30 minutes in the kind of late afternoon when the sun was going down, so not going to burn you too badly, or in the early afternoon, and make sure that people got that sun exposure onto their skin wearing shorts and a tank top or so. And what they found is that it significantly elevated levels of those hormones and feelings of well-being, something that we've known forever. You probably didn't even need the study, but now that the study's published, we can look to that. And the feelings of well-being associated with getting some regular sunlight exposure are related to this activation of this tyrosinase pathway and the release of dopamine, which again is a neuromodulator involved in many things, not just mood, but generally when we have a little bit higher circulating dopamine, or release of dopamine in the brain, we feel more positive anticipation. We enjoy things more. We have more energy. It's part of a small group of molecules called the catecholamines, which is dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Those three act as a kind of cocktail in our brain and body to make us feel like we have energy. And in the winter months, when we're not getting as much sunlight, especially when we're not viewing morning sunlight, we're getting less sunlight down to our skin. That's why in certain locations on the earth, people feel malaise. They feel less excited about life. Dopamine levels are lower, which makes perfect sense given that sunlight is activating the pathways that trigger dopamine synthesis. So that's a lot of biology. It's kind of a chapter of biology kind of stuffed into one rambling sentence. But when you look at the mechanisms of these things, you start to realize like sunlight's great for us, but not too much.
Yeah.
And the timing of sunlight really matters. And artificial light, while wonderful, I mean, we all rely on it. It's a good idea to dim the lights at night. It's a good idea to turn off the phone when you go to sleep. It's a good idea to look at most artificial light in the same way that you would view nutrition and calories. You're not just interested in getting enough calories, you want nutritious calories, right? That's really, I think, what we've come to conclude these days, whether or not you're vegan or vegetarian, omnivore or whatever. Artificial lights are mostly blue light, short wavelength light. Sunlight is full spectrum. It has reds, it has oranges, it has pinks. Even on overcast days, it has all that stuff. Even though you can't see it, it's coming through. So artificial lights, I look at as a bit of like empty calorie light. It doesn't do much for you. It's not great for you. It's not necessarily bad, but getting a lot of that without getting enough full spectrum light is why I believe a lot of people are experiencing malaise. I think a lot of the mental health issues that we observe nowadays in kids and adults are not just related to the content of what they're looking at. It's related to the illumination format, the being in a screen all day, being under artificial lights all day, not getting outside enough. And as a final incentive for getting outside a bit, not too much each day, there's some beautiful studies looking at myopia, nearsightedness, and the fact that kids and adults who get outside, even if they're on their laptop or tablet or phone for 2 hours a day or more, again, you can be in the shade, don't get burned. I'm not suggesting anyone bake themselves in the sun for 2 hours a day or more, are offsetting the development, in some cases, partially reversing the effects of looking at things too close and being indoors, which is myopia, nearsightedness. So there's so many incentives for getting outside a bit, but yes, avoid getting a sunburn. And sunscreen is one way to do it. Physical barrier is another. And if you want to know what's enough light, keep in mind that all of these systems I'm talking about, they're slow integrating systems. So if you get out on the weekend quite a bit more, Monday and Tuesday, you're probably fine.
Yeah.
Wednesday, you're probably fine. But then, try and take a walk in midday, take your lunch outside, get out onto a balcony midday. If you spend 5 days indoors, you'll really notice the negative effects. And if you've been doing that and you feel lousy, there could be any number of reasons, but lack of adequate sunlight might be one of them. Too much sunlight is the amount that burns you or gives you skin cancer. And people differ in terms of what that level of exposure is. So I can't sit here and say 2 hours a day. You need to, be able to really gauge what's safe for you. But, if you're avoiding sunlight like the plague, that's not good either.
Do you think sunglasses have a place, or they're more of a fashion item?
Sunglasses have their place. I have very sensitive eyes. We all, vary in terms of how much we can tolerate bright light of any kind. I need sunglasses during the middle of the day to drive, in some cases to be out. For the morning sunlight viewing, I don't think you need it. But if you feel you do, maybe you have just very sensitive eyes. I think they definitely have their place. And I use them for safety reasons. I use them when I'm out. But if you're constantly in dark sunglasses and then you're going into artificial lights indoors, and then in the evening you're watching Netflix or you're on your computer tablet, you're basically doing everything in reverse. And what's interesting is, we hear about jet lag. We hear about shift work. We've known for decades that shift workers have an immense number of different serious problems with mental health and physical health. It's just, and thank goodness for shift workers. They're very beneficial to society. We need them. And so thank you, shift workers. But here's what's interesting. Almost everybody nowadays, including our young children, qualify as shift workers based on the definition of shift work, which is doing work or cognitive engaging stuff for 3 hours or more past sundown. that's shift work. You're working into the evening. And I'm not one to think, okay, we need to go back to our cave dwelling ways, but I think we just need to be aware of what we're doing to ourselves. And these studies that I mentioned earlier out of the UK really speak to the key importance of light during the day and darkness at night, not pitch black at night and glaring sunlight burning your skin during the day. That's not what we're talking about. But in moderation, these things can be very, very helpful.
That kind of leads to what I want to talk about next, which is to do with anti-aging. And I know the sun can be a factor within that. For people that are going through midlife, both women and men, what do you recommend for improving skin elasticity, collagen, foods, supplements? Because a lot of people, when they start going through that time in their life, it can be really hard. I mean, they can do a lot of exercise, but it's still kind of, that builds muscle, but it's not changing the skin elasticity that much. I'd love you to talk to that.
Yeah. So aging and offsetting the effects of aging is a multifactorial thing, of course. And I'll just, always go back to those 6 pillars. If you're not sleeping enough, and what is enough? Enough is the amount that allows you to feel rested during the day, except for perhaps the need for a brief 10 to 90 minute nap. Some people don't like naps, some people do. A lot of people say I have insomnia. Insomnia is defined as excessive daytime sleepiness. Excessive daytime sleepiness. Not getting a great night's sleep is not insomnia. But getting your sleep right, and we've done many episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast on this. We have a series coming out with Matt Walker, who wrote the book Why We Sleep, later this year. Getting your sleep right is key. And again, nutrition, movement, controlling stress, relationships, sunlight, all essential to slowing the aging process. And there are, hundreds of thousands of studies to support that. Now, with respect to skin specifically, I think there are a couple things that are a little less known that I think are particularly powerful. So I'll mention those first.
Yeah, great.
The first is keeping the gut microbiome healthy. It's now clear that the trillions of little microbiota that live in our gut, everywhere, all the way along our gut, are essential for the production of little fatty acids, which sound bad. Anytime people hear fat, they go, I don't want fat. But that fatty acids are great, that then provide the substrate for creating neuromodulators, neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, et cetera. And those neuromodulators are absolutely essential for cognitive function, maintaining brain health. In addition, the gut microbiome is but one of the many microbiomes that we have on us and in us. And one of the primary microbiomes, and this is rarely discussed, but hopefully this will be an opportunity for that, is the skin microbiome. Many of the microbiota that, I know it's weird to think about trillions of things living on our skin, actually provide a barrier to bacteria and viruses that are constantly trying to bombard us, get into our system. The skin microbiome is supported by healthy gut microbiota. And the best way to support all of these microbiome niches on the skin, in the gut, on the surface of the eyes, even in the urethra, et cetera, is clearly through the consumption of enough fiber, and both prebiotic and probiotic fiber, so fruits and veggies kind of thing, but also to make sure that you're getting at least some servings of low sugar fermented foods now and again. So this could be kefir, yogurt, again, low sugar, sauerkraut, kimchi, natto, different cultures have these things. People always say beer, okay, yes, beer, but maybe not the best source given the negative effects of alcohol and the excess in calories and sugar, which frankly don't contribute anything to nutrition, et cetera. But it's very clear from work by my colleague Justin Sonnenberg at Stanford School of Medicine and others that a regular consumption of these low sugar fermented foods, 1 to 4 servings per day. So find one that you like and just try and have a couple spoonfuls of sauerkraut or kimchi or have a pickle or something. And it has to be the stuff that needs to be refrigerated, the briny taste, that salty taste. The gut microbiome loves that. And the skin microbiome benefits when the gut microbiome is healthy. And the skin microbiome in particular benefits when you're not killing it off with things like, I hate to say this because we need chlorine in pools, the public pools, but things like chlorine are killing the microbiome. That's why it's in the water, right? Because they're trying to kill off all the bugs. So does it mean I don't use hand sanitizer? No, of course not. I'll use some hand sanitizer. But trying to take good care of one's skin through not using harsh astringents, this kind of thing, all of that gut microbiome stuff, I spent the last 5 minutes talking about it because that's providing the milieu the environment for the skin microbiome and the skin to flourish. Then there's the stuff from the inside. Like, what are you doing from the inside? Well, everyone knows if you're not getting enough sleep, the skin suffers. The bags under the eyes being the least of it, the skin suffers. You'll notice if you have a cut, it'll heal more slowly.
Yeah.
Many people get acne when they're not sleeping enough, and that's because of the intrusion of late evening cortisol, a hormone that's very valuable and very beneficial that we all manufacture and release early in the day. It's great to have released early in the day, but late release of cortisol in our system due to stress, due to excessive consumption of caffeine in the afternoon and evening. I hate to say it, but consumption of alcohol before sleep, you're not getting into deep rapid eye movement sleep. Cortisol levels end up higher throughout the night. And as a consequence, many people experience sometimes skin blemishes, but the whole process of repairing the skin every night, which happens every single night, the dermis and the epidermis, is occurring during a specific phase of sleep, the first 4 hours of sleep. And we all know the experience of not getting enough sleep and someone just looks depleted.
Yes.
The pallor of their skin changes. We can see it when somebody's not rested. We see it in the lack of kind of brightness in their eyes. And these are all kind of peripheral signals of not getting enough sleep. So get your sleep right, get your microbiome right. And that can take some work, but it's something that those are things that will benefit everything. And then we get to the sort of collagen question. It's always the collagen. Yes, collagen is the critical component of skin. There is some evidence that consumption of high quality collagen supplements can make a minor, I really want to highlight this, a minor improvement in certain things like elasticity of skin, in wound repair. There's also evidence that red light, these like nowadays is very popular, that red light and near infrared light can accelerate, say healing from acne, can improve some metrics of skin, quote unquote, quality. These aren't metrics that are, really easy to classify, but none of those even come close to the essential benefits of sleep and microbiome support that other studies support for skin. Now, in addition to that, as long as we're here, we can talk about the somewhat more adventurous and esoteric stuff. Like nowadays, there's a lot of enthusiasm about peptides. Everyone's into peptides. I can tell you where I live in California, there's a lot of peptide use, right? Some of these are serums that people put on the skin. Some of them are injectable things like BPC 157, which, by the way, it seems, there aren't a lot of clinical studies, but it seems that it can help with wound healing and skin repair. But BPC 157 is essentially a synthetic mimic of what? A gut peptide.
Oh, wow.
It's long been known that certain juices within the gut help us repair wounds. And if you ever had a cut in your mouth, you'll notice something interesting. The mouth is a bacteria-filled, moist, warm place, perfect for infections. And guess what? Things in the mouth heal fast.
So fast.
And they heal without a scar. There are rare cases where it scars.
Yeah.
That just should blow everyone's mind. It's like, how come a cut on the body surface heals much slower, sometimes with a scar, but in the mouth where it's all like warm and moist and there's bacteria, I just breathed in probably trillion of bacteria right here, even though the air is clean here, it's everywhere. Why is that? How is that? Well, there are things within the saliva and within the juices of the gut, such as what BPC 157 is designed to mimic, that support constant turnover of the cells there. So there are some interesting things like BPC 157, anything that, and I am not promoting the use of growth hormone or IGF-1 because that can promote the growth of tumors and things of that sort. But it is true that young children, teens, it's amazing, right? First of all, babies, who has better skin than babies, right? We saw a baby down on Bondi Beach, this little baby thing. Like just looking at you just want to their cheeks, they look so cute, right? And they're just they're perfect, right? Like the kid is perfect. And God forbid if a kid or a baby gets a cut on it, heals up as if it was never there. And their system is chock-a-block full of what? Full of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, growth hormone. Now, adults think, okay, I'll take IGF-1. I'll take a peptide like sermorelin or ipamorelin that will promote IGF-1. And you think, oh, is that the right idea? And then you step back and you think, let's be biologists about this. The fastest rate of aging that we ever go through is between birth and age 20. Look at somebody when they're 5 and look at them when they're 12. They are developing, but there's another word for developing. They are aging. So if you look at people who take things like growth hormone or IGF-1 or peptides that push on those pathways, yes, they feel more vigorous, but they're actually accelerating their aging. And that's underappreciated. So things to promote healthy skin should always, be of I think the sort of foundational things: sleep, microbiome. Maybe there's a use case for collagen if someone has the disposable income and they kind of want that edge. Avoiding excessive sun exposure, for sure. Avoiding excessive stress. We know that the graying of hair is in part just age dependent and in part is controlled by stress. We now know that. Right, it's amazing. Down in the hair follicle niche, the little pocket that the hair follicle lives in, there's a stem cell that gives rise to the hair. And this is so wild. The stress pathways release noradrenaline around that niche. And what causes the graying of hair with stress is that inside of that pocket, that niche, it releases a peroxide. You know, in the 80s when they were like, hey, well, you wouldn't know from the 80s, but I remember from the 80s, people were dyeing their hair, putting that in.
People do it now,
They bleach, you can bleach hair with peroxide. Your body produces certain peroxides under conditions of stress, which is why when people stress a lot, yes, their hair grays more. And the good news is when they're less stressed, and there are lots of ways to reduce stress, their hair, some degree of graying can be reversed. Now, there is, of course, an age-related graying of hair that is related to that same pathway and some other pathways. But when you start to look at like skin, hair, nails stuff, it almost always takes us back to the basics. Now that as long as we're having fun with this, and I have no relationship to any company that makes it, but there's been a lot of discussion of the NAD pathway. This is a molecule that's very present in all cells, especially early in development. It goes down across development, and there's a lot of interest nowadays. Some people get NAD infusions. Those are very painful, very expensive. You feel like you're getting stepped on by a donkey. Which, do they have donkeys down here? By a horse? A donkey is just kind of a mutant horse that can't reproduce. Or, think Shrek. It's uncomfortable, but then afterwards you feel good. But things like NMN, NR, these have been sold as supplements for longevity. It's still hotly debated whether or not they can extend the lifespan. My personal view is they cannot. But my own experience with NMN and NR, and that of many other people, and again, I have no financial relationship to this, is that daily consumption of NMN, which is a precursor to NAD, or NR, which is also in the NAD pathway, does seem to give one more energy, physical energy, and people do observe faster growth of hair and nails. It's a pretty well-established anecdata set, but there's been no formal clinical trials of it. So, and there's debate as to whether or not taking NMN or NR can increase certain kinds of cancers. So, as soon as you get into this space, there's always the potential benefit, the potential risk. And so I just mentioned these things because you asked about supplements, but, I think the basics are most key. And it's kind of a disappointing answer, perhaps, like, oh, you want great skin, get great sleep. But I don't care how much NAD you're taking. If you're not sleeping well, your skin's going to suffer.
What about for especially women, all those creams that we're sold, like anti-aging for wrinkles, put this on your eyes, put this on this, the 3 things in the morning, does any of that stuff actually work?
Yeah, I think we're going to do an episode on skin health, and so I'm yet to fully explore this, but I've started talking to dermatologists, especially those that specialize in cancers, but also cosmetic dermatologists. And, I think there are some serums and creams and things of that sort that get into these cellular growth pathways and the elasticity of the skin layers that show some either marginal or moderate effect. So I'm not going to say that they're all complete garbage. I think some actually have their value. The problem is we just don't have a lot of clinical trials. So it depends on your stance. I'm somebody who obviously values science and clinical trials, but there is also a huge population of people out there that, while they're not saying I'll take anything to have, younger looking skin, they're like, yeah, if it seems reasonably safe, I'll try it. I think there's some logical mechanisms to support the use of collagen, certain peptides that have been shown to improve the turnover of the cells in the dermal layers and the epidermal layers of the skin, limiting stress. And when we say stress, there's whole body stress, but then there's also stress to specific tissues. So, for instance, every cell in the body has the opportunity, relies on mitochondria for energy production. And the more a cell is active, like a skin cell, which has a lot of turnover, or a neuron, a nerve cell, the more what are called reactive oxygen species that it creates, which is, we won't get into the chemistry of it too much, but there's a free electron that's released, and those free electrons can call these like reactive oxygen species, which then cause damage to the cells, etc. So reducing reactive oxygen species is generally good. Improving mitochondrial function is generally good. How can we improve mitochondrial function in skin and make our skin more youthful, or our eyes more youthful? And there, the data on red light and near infrared light is really interesting. Wow. There's studies out of the University of College London by my colleague, known him for decades, Glenn Jeffrey. He's done these studies showing that if people 40 or older view red light for a couple minutes in the morning, and this is just of a conventional light of red hue at a distance, you're not trying to, please don't get it too close to your eyes, just look at it for a couple of minutes, you can offset some of the age-related vision loss.
Wow.
Now, why would that be? Well, the photoreceptors of the eye that are responsible for converting light into electrical and chemical signals that the brain can understand use a ton of mitochondrial energy, and they build up a ton of reactive oxygen species. This red light exposure seems to help. So do you have to run out and buy a red light? Well, the answer is no. Why? Well, because sunlight is full spectrum light, and within the full spectrum is red light. So that morning sunlight exposure may, this specific study hasn't been done, but it stands to reason based on the Glenn Jeffrey work in the laboratory where they expose people to artificial red light, may offset some of the age-related vision loss. Similarly, there are, I would say a couple dozen or more studies on humans looking at the effects of red light and near-infrared light panels, having people be exposed to those for about 10 or 15 minutes per morning on things like hormone health and skin health, elasticity, and appearance. And those studies point to some interesting effects on improving the skin health and turnover of skin. And there's a mechanism to look to. So whereas I can't say this cream contains blank, which does blank to the cells, the full spectrum light business, the red light makes a lot of sense because you're reducing reactive oxygen species in the skin. Now, by extension, you might say, well, then just go get a lot of sunlight on the skin, but there's a threshold. Just as you don't want to stare at a red light and burn your eyes out, you don't want to get outside and get so much activation of the skin with sunlight that you burn the skin. So, the dose is in the poison. So my suggestion would be to consider the incredible effects of light on skin, eyes, circadian rhythm, and then ask yourself, how willing and able am I to get this morning sunlight exposure on a regular basis? When I travel, I bring a very small red light panel that I'll use, that I'll look at in the morning if it's very overcast and I'm on a plane. So that I can get that exposure, because I'd like to keep I'm 48 years old, I'd like to keep my vision. I suppose I'm less concerned about my skin, I just try not to burn. But I understand why people are interested in and want these things. And if you're doing that, plus maybe you decide to take some collagen, you're trying to get great sleep, microbiome, I think you're doing pretty much whatever you can. The real extreme would be, I know people are now traveling to Central and South America to get stem cell injections. Everyone's like stem cell. That I do not recommend. There's just simply not enough science yet. And the key word there is yet. We just don't know. And there was a study there was a clinic in Florida that was injecting stem cells into the eyes to offset macular degeneration in some patients that were concerned about losing their vision. And sadly, all of those patients went blind.
Really?
Permanently blind, which is why the FDA in the United States has banned the use of stem cell injections for these kinds of purposes. So it took just that one clinic basically shut down all of stem cell clinics, legal stem cell clinics in the US for a good amount of time. And I think there is some interesting use cases for stem cells, but unfortunately, we're going to have to wait because that one clinic just kind of rushed out ahead of everybody, and it was a very tragic case. So, I'm waiting with bated breath on the stem cell work, but we just have to put safety first.
I want to talk now about meditation and a bit of breath work as well to do with that, because I know that you like yoga nidra and sort of the art of stillness and what that does with mental health. So for me, when I discovered meditation, it was like, when I was doing breakfast radio and the hours were crazy, it was like shift work. I started meditating and I thought, oh my God, like I have a monkey mind, like my mind, I can't even think thought to thought. They're just like waving past 100 miles an hour. And then I ended up finding meditation that I really liked, that was guided, and it kind of became very life-changing for me. And I felt that, times that I meditate, and I'm doing this meditation at the moment that It goes for like an hour and a half. But
Wow.
within that, it has the Wim Hof breath work.
Oh, great.
So you focus on all different, it takes you essentially through the chakras. And after each one, you do the inhale, exhale, and so by the end, you're on cloud 9, but it's all done lying down. And the ideas that have come to me during that meditation have been next level. And then I've moved forward with them. And some of them have really been quite life-changing. I want to know your experience with meditation, and I know that you also have a great story about Rick Rubin that I'd like you to talk about.
Yeah. So, first of all, it sounds like a very interesting meditation practice that you do. An hour and a half is really impressive, and I say impressive because I think most people are not going to commit that amount of time, but if one is willing, there's tremendous benefits to even short, but especially long meditations of the sort that you described. So, my history with meditation is very simple. I was a wayward youth, and a counselor that I was assigned to gave me the book Wherever You Go, There You Are by Jon Kabat-Zinn. And in that book, it exposes the reader to a practice of simply sitting, closing one's eyes. It's called third eye meditation, just kind of focusing one's energy at a point right behind the forehead and focusing on one's breathing. And every time one's mind drifts, which by the way happens to everybody, you draw it back to your breathing, or the third eye center, as it's called. Very simple, extremely beneficial. Why? What do we know now, 30 plus years later, about what something as simple as doing that can do? Well, first of all, a meditation like that has two major benefits. One is it's really a focus exercise. If you think about it, it's learning to focus and refocus and refocus and refocus. Now it's a closed eye meditation. There are open eye meditations, of course. But in addition to that, it is teaching oneself about so-called interoception. Now, we have exteroception, which is paying attention to or perceiving everything beyond the confines of our skin. And then we have interoception, which is our paying attention of things, of stuff within our gut, with how fast our heart is beating, how we feel at the level of the surface of our body. You mentioned the chakras, which are, this is from relatively ancient traditions that carry forward still to this day, of the different locations, 7 locations, starting at essentially the perineum and then moving up to genitals, the gut, the heart, the throat, the mind, the top of the head, right? Do I have that right?
You got it
yes.
right.
Okay, great. So, and by the way, as a relevant aside, I think the chakras are very interesting from the standpoint of neuroscience and vice versa, because I think it is not a coincidence that the chakras are focused on those centers in the body as opposed to like the shoulders and the cheek. And because I study and I teach neuroanatomy, if you look at the neuroanatomy of those locations, they are sites of particularly rich confluence of blood vasculature, hormone release, and neural innervation. Okay, so that they represent hubs within our body systems. Okay, whereas if we were to look at the shoulder, sure, there's nerves, there's blood, there's hormones released there too, but they are not they're not a key station within the body. And then there's some interesting stuff about all along the spine, we have these what are called chains of ganglia, which are collections of neurons that work in concert with one another to deploy certain resources just to the legs, or more to the legs than to the heart or to the mind. We all know what it's like to be in our head versus in our body. Sensing down into the first and second chakra kind of puts us down in the lower part of our body, puts our consciousness there, which is not mystical. It's putting our interoception in that region. And when we concentrate, when we perceive on a particular area of our body, well, then the activation of that area of our body increases. So when one meditates the way that I described, or the way that you allude to, that you meditate, you are activating certain areas of the brain and body as you do it. So you can increase interoceptive awareness by meditating, and one can also learn to focus by meditating. And there are many, many forms of meditation. There's sort of these open frame meditations where you're not trying to focus on anything. You just kind of pay attention to whatever drifts through, kind of watching it like a cloud going by. There are open eye meditations, walking meditations. But I think it's worth mentioning, especially to people that aren't familiar with meditation, that meditation is most forms of meditation, that is, are focus exercises. Things like NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, lying down deliberately relaxing while staying completely still, doing some long exhale breathing, which always takes the body into a more relaxed state. So lengthening the exhales relative to the inhales will always relax us. I can explain why that is in a moment. That's more of a way to restore mental and physical vigor. Meditation can do that as well, but meditation is more of a focusing interoceptive exercise. NSDR Yoga Nidra, which just simply means yoga sleep, is more of a way to restore mental and physical vigor, especially when one hasn't slept enough. I find it to be a wonderful practice. And then there's the entire field, and by the way, this is a medically approved field of clinical hypnosis, not stage hypnosis, which involves going into deep relaxation by long exhale breathing and listening to a script and creating a state in the mind and body of being very relaxed, but very focused on a particular context. And medical hypnosis is designed to solve a particular problem. Okay, so it's different than meditation, it's different than NSDR, and all three are different from one another, but there's some overlap at the margins, okay? So I think that's worth mentioning because what we call meditation is actually many things. Non-sleep deep rest is a different thing, and hypnosis is yet another. You asked about Rick Rubin, and I think the story about Rick is a really a good jumping off point to kind of weave back to that and which one or ones people might opt to use in their life. And why. So Rick is a friend. I'm very grateful and lucky to call him a friend. And Rick is obviously an incredibly creative person in the field of music, and also had the wonderful book, The Creative Act. It's a book I highly recommend. It's already a spectacularly successful book, but for a reason. Rick has this incredible track record of being able to bring out the best creative works in all these musical artists from different genres, from hip hop, from punk, from classical. He and I actually both share a love of Gregorian chants and things like that. He also happens to be a fan of the sauna and cold plunge, which is how we initially got to know one another. We started sauna and cold plunging and chatting together. Well, I've spent enough time with Rick to know that a good portion of his time is spent either sitting or lying down with eyes closed, completely still, but wide awake, which is very much like NSDR or Yoga Nidra, but perhaps with a more alert mind than his body and eyes would suggest. I think some people would see that and think he's just lying there, but he's not just lying there. He's lying there thinking and feeling and listening with rapt attention. And so the lack of movement in his body is misleading. There's a lot going on in there. And he's able to hear things other people aren't able to hear. He's able to think up ideas that other people clearly aren't able to think up. And I got very intrigued by that practice of lying down with eyes closed or sitting down with eyes closed, but keeping the mind very alert because of its similarity to non-sleep deep rest and Yoga Nidra. Although during non-sleep deep rest and Yoga Nidra, one tends to go into a pseudo sleep state. What Rick does is different. There are a couple of examples, but the most notable one would be a colleague of mine at Stanford, Carl Diceroth, who was a guest on the podcast. He's a phenomenally successful scientist and physician. He's sort of our Michael Jordan of neuroscience and bioengineering. And he has a practice where he sits completely still in a chair each night, closes his eyes, and forces himself to think in complete sentences. It's like, wow, these are interesting practices. And both of them, and many other examples that I could provide, but we probably don't want to waste time on listing out too many examples of people who are immensely creative, immensely innovative by doing this practice, at least in part by doing this practice. We don't know correlation causation, obviously. So what's going on there? Well, there's a state of sleep that we all experience if we sleep long enough into the night. First half of sleep during the night is dominated by slow wave, aka deep sleep, release of growth hormone. Second half of the night is more dominated by rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. Rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, which was discovered by several people, but was kind of popularized as a thing by Dr. William Dement at Stanford University Sleep Laboratory, is a state in which we are completely paralyzed. This is a healthy thing. And our dreams tend to be very vivid. And the eyes, as the name suggests, are rapidly moving about. That pattern of body and brain activity, of body completely still and brain very active, is also the state of mind that is associated with creative ideas that we know, based on a lot of literature and examples, have resulted in everything from the discovery of electricity to discovery of the 8-carbon ring in organic chemistry, of which things like testosterone and estrogen happen to be, et cetera, to things like the periodic table, and things of that sort. Now, here we're connecting a good number of dots, but if one is interested in being more innovative, more creative, how does one do that? Some people are like, oh, I'll take psychedelics. Well, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's not. There are a lot of considerations there, frankly. Maybe one likes to take walks. Maybe one likes to take a long jog, which is a practice that I enjoy for coming up with ideas or for clearing out in kind of like invasive thoughts and things like that. So body active, mind relatively still. But this quote unquote meditation or practice that Rick and Carl and Einstein, frankly, and so many others have made a major part of their life, of body still, mind deliberately active, seems to be a particularly robust one for coming up with creative insights and ideas. And I think it's something that most people don't do, including myself, but I've started to embark on a practice of this. And I think is really interesting because, who wouldn't want to have more creativity? Who wouldn't want to come up with new ideas? And maybe not just for sake of work, maybe for sake of relationship, maybe for sake of like what to do with one's life. I think that the key thing here is to not put too much pressure on the practice. Maybe take 10 minutes and try and stay wide awake with body still as possible, and eyes closed, and see where it takes you. I mean, these are obviously zero cost, safe, provided they're done in a safe environment, activities. And, Rick is but one example, but he's a pretty robust example of a hyper-creative person who, mind you, has done all this stuff in music, but by his own words, doesn't play a musical instrument and can't work a soundboard. So if that's not a savant, I don't know what is. But I think we're all intrigued by these hyper-creative types, and it's kind of fun to think that, well, maybe they're not like, genetically wired for creativity. Maybe they just are wired somehow by experience or by genes or by both to be more willing to explore these kind of atypical waking states of body still, mind very active.
I want to talk about breath work now, because that's been life-changing for me in so many different ways. Like, I'll tell you a quick story. For years, and I don't even know how this came about because it wasn't from any experience I had, and when I was young, I was fine. When I went into my 20s, I just became fearful of going on planes, like the claustrophobia. And I was like, just did not want to, like, I would never not go on the plane. It wasn't that bad. But I could feel my heart start beating, and I really don't suffer from anxiety or panic attacks or anything like that, except for when I was going on a plane, I could feel the panic rising, right? I tried a hypnotist, I tried this and that, and nothing really worked. And then someone said something to me one day. They said, why don't you try box breathing? And I was like, all right, that seems pretty easy. And they taught me how to do it. And literally it was the most life-changing thing. Like in an instant, I realized by controlling my breath, I didn't have to try and distract myself, think of other things, change my thoughts, get up, try and talk to someone, that my heart rate would just immediately become normal. It wouldn't start rapidly beating as it used to when I would get on planes. And I thought to myself, my God, the breath, this thing that we come into the earth with and we leave with, is like the most powerful thing that we can have. And it doesn't cost us any money, and we take it for granted, right? And then I went to this Wim Hof retreat a couple of years ago, and I started learning the Wim Hof technique of breathing, which you would know about, a lot of people do, which is, full on, especially if you're at a retreat like that and you're lying down, you do round after round after round. It's really intense. Yeah. And it kind of gets you to the ice baths later on, but I love the breath part. I thought that was amazing. I don't know if you can explain this to me. There's 30 strangers literally lying on their mats, most of them men, and we're doing this breathing, most as well for the first time. I'd never done it before. And like, I don't know, maybe it was an hour or something like that. And then like I can hear the room start crying. I'm crying, having my own experience. My body is just like hardcore shaking, but you feel amazing. This is nothing negative is happening, right? And then we all get out of it and we talk about our experience. I think every second person had some sort of what you would say, like they had some sort of visitation with a dead person, or there were these crazy experiences. How is that possible?
Yeah, so there are a lot of ways we could go here. I suppose. Well, I'll start off by saying that respiration, breathing, and breath work is something my lab has worked extensively on. We've published clinical trials on this. I've done Wim Hof breathing before. I do want to point out one thing. By the way, I hats off to Wim and family. I know them, and I think he's certainly a pioneer in this whole thing of bringing breath work forward. The type of breathing that is Wim Hof breathing that you describe is what's called, in my world, cyclic hyperventilation.
Yes.
So it's deliberate hyperventilation. Another component of the Wim Hof method includes exposure to cold water. It is really important as we march into this discussion to highlight that people should never, ever combine cyclic hyperventilation or, frankly, breath work of any kind with getting into cold water. There have been some shallow water blackouts and some deaths because people haven't been doing it correctly. Yes. So that's very important to highlight. But that aside, and I just want to say, again, hats off to women family for trying to popularize these cyclic hyperventilation methods. They have their merits in the right context. If we just step back and we say, okay, what is breath work and why does it work and what does it do? We can get to some pretty simple and quick conclusions. First of all, breathing is a very interesting aspect of our body and brain because the centers for breathing, which reside in an area called the brainstem toward the back of the brain or the neck, two brain areas mainly, an area called the pre-Botzinger complex, named after a bottle of wine, believe it or not, discovered by Jack Feldman at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the parafacial nucleus, another brain area, are the two brain areas that control breathing. And they control breathing in a very interesting way. The pre-Botzinger complex controls rhythmic breathing. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Could even be inhale, exhale, but rhythmic breathing. Inhale follows exhale follows inhale follows exhale. The parafacial nucleus is a set of neurons that control breathing anytime there's a doubling up of inhales or exhales. So inhale, inhale, exhale, or when we're speaking. So as I'm speaking, I'm not doing inhale, exhale. I'm kind of, we don't want this to become about speech, but get this. If this doesn't blow people's minds, I don't know what will, but this blew my mind. Language, speech, you're literally just shaping exhales.
Really?
You've just got the folds of the larynx and pharynx, which tend to be thicker in men, not always. Why? Because testosterone thickens those folds. They vibrate at lower frequency, and you're just, as you're exhaling, you're shaping how much wind comes out of there. And then, of course, we use our tongue against the back of our teeth or our lips to shape what's coming out. So we're just shaping exhales. Okay. Two brain areas control different patterns of breathing, rhythmic and arrhythmic breathing. We know with certainty that when we inhale through the nose, through the mouth, with vigor or without vigor, that we are increasing our heart rate. When we exhale, whether or not we do it deliberately through the mouth, through the nose, it doesn't matter, we slow our heart rate down. This is because of something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which sounds bad. Everyone hears arrhythmia, it's bad, but it has to do with the fact that when we inhale, we create space in our chest cavity. The heart gets a little bit larger, and the volume of blood in the heart moves a little bit more slowly in that larger volume. And as a consequence, the nervous system goes, we need to speed the heart rate up a little bit, move it through. So inhale, boom, 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 heart rate goes up a little bit. Exhale, the opposite happens. The heart gets a little bit smaller. Blood is moving more quickly through that smaller volume. And there's a signal from the parasympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, which is just fancy nerd speak. You can forget that, to slow the heart rate down. What this means is if you learn nothing else about breath work from this conversation, when you inhale, you're speeding your heart rate up. And when you exhale, you're calming yourself down. This is important because normally when a child or an adult is stressed, what do we say? Take a deep breath, which is the exact opposite of what you want to do. You want to completely exhale all your air and then start controlling your breath rate to try and make it slower, emphasizing the duration and or the intensity of the exhales. So in real time, you can calm yourself down by extending your exhales. There's a particular pattern of breathing where you double up on the inhales and then exhale really long, called physiological sigh. I didn't discover it, although I suppose I'm guilty of popularizing it in modern times, where you inhale twice through the nose, one big deep inhale through the nose to fill your lungs, and then another one to maximally inflate the lungs. So, and then completely exhale all your air to lungs empty. That's the fastest way to completely calm down. In fact, if one is ever feeling stressed, provided you're not underwater, this best way to calm yourself down quickly is a big deep inhale through the nose and then another tiny inhale, sneaking one in there. Even if you feel you're not getting any air in there, you're doing something very special to the lungs, and we don't have time to get into it, so that when you exhale all your air, you're offloading carbon dioxide and you will calm yourself down almost immediately. You might have to do it a second time, but trust me, it works the first time, it works every time, because that's what it does normally in sleep when carbon dioxide levels get too high in your bloodstream. So most breathwork practices, whether or not it's box breathing or Wim Hof breathing, which is cyclic hyperventilation breathing, take those two basic elements of inhales increase heart rate, exhales decrease heart rate, and use them in some combination. So you said box breathing. Box breathing is inhale, hold, exhale, hold, equal duration. So inhale for 2, hold for 2, exhale for 2, hold for 2, box breathing. Highly unusual pattern of breathing. When we do it, we are essentially controlling the exhales, and the breath holds tend to shut down some of the neurons in those rhythmic breathing centers of the Prebot-Singer complex. And as a consequence, that hyperventilation that's normally associated with stress, we short circuit that. Wim Hof breathing, also called Tumo breathing, also called Kundalini breathing, also called any number of different things, is simply emphasizing the inhales. So Wim Hof breathing, and I know this because I've spent a lot of time with Wim and his family in Spain. They came to the Bay Area in 2016, long before I even, thought I would ever have a podcast. Know them well. Again, wonderful people. Just don't do cyclic hyperventilation in water, please. What do they have you do in Wim Hof breathing? Big inhale, and then let the air fall out of your mouth passively. So active, big, vigorous inhale, and then, and as you do that, you heat up immediately. Your heart rate increases. You're releasing adrenaline from the adrenal glands and from an area of the brain called the locus ceruleus in the brainstem. And why do people hallucinate, cry, etc.? Because you're ramping up activation of the autonomic nervous system, and you're doing it in a very non-specific way. So the body and the brain are in this very activated state, but you're kind of restricted to your mat. Maybe sometimes people shake or they feel like they want to move. And if you're Wim, I'll do my best Wim impression. He'll be like, "Hunda, hunda." It's a very colorful character. He'll do his horse pose, he'll grab his banjo, does this thing. Okay, but anytime you see people doing Kundalini breathing, Wim Hof breathing, the reason it looks to a typical person, to a non-practitioner as like, whoa, that looks crazy, is because people are flooding themselves with adrenaline.
Yeah.
Now, the macro on this, the big takeaway is that breathing is special in that gut motility, digestion of food, heart rate, all of those things are controlled by the so-called automatic nervous system, but breathing is too, but breathing is unique because it lies at the interface of conscious control and unconscious control. I, for instance, cannot make myself digest faster just by wanting to. I can try and calm myself down, which can help me digest faster, but that's indirect. I can't, because I'm not a trained practitioner, change the size of my pupils. Some trained yogis can do that. But that's an autonomic function. However, right now I can decide to hold my breath. I can breathe faster. I can breathe more slowly. So breathing is it bridges the conscious and unconscious control over what? Over our level of alertness and relaxation. And in that way, it's a dial. It's a set of knobs that we can use to control our inner landscape. And so nowadays we hear a lot about breath work. I sort of chuckle because back in 2015, when I would say breath work, people were like, oh yeah, breath work and magic carpets also, or levitation. And you're like, no, it's just breathing. Nowadays, I think meditation, breath work, and by extension, therapeutic use of psychedelics in a safe context have kind of made it through the filter of that's not just crazy counterculture hippie stuff. Now, I'm from the Bay Area, so we can talk. I can say that with some self-effacing humor to it. But in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, if you were into meditation, breath work, or psychedelics, you were a radical hippie. Now we know on the basis of neuroimaging, neurochemistry, studies in humans, some studies in animals, but mostly humans, and some clinical trials, including some that I've published in collaboration with my colleague David Spiegel at Stanford School of Medicine, that breath work, meditation, and let's leave psychedelics out for the moment, these are powerful tools to adjust our inner state.
Yeah.
And so there's really nothing mystical about it. People will argue, oh, when you do cyclic hyperventilation breathing, you're releasing DMT, this molecule that people call it the God molecule. I'll be honest, no strong evidence for that. Do I think it's impossible? No. I said no strong, let's say, scientific peer-reviewed evidence for it. DMT is a drug that some people take recreationally or therapeutically as well. We'll leave that aside. I have not tried it. I don't know what the safety margins are on that. So let's just kind of push that aside. But the mechanisms for how this works for how cyclic hyperventilation creates these wild states of mind and body has been, let's just say, more speculative than precise. Things like, oh, you're decalcifying the pineal and you're not. You're not decalcifying the pineal. It's a DMT release. Maybe not. Chances are what's happening is that you're activating the autonomic nervous system somewhat non-specifically, so you're getting a dump of dopamine, serotonin, and other things, which is not to say it isn't useful. I guess done safely, these can be powerful practices. And if nothing else, consciously controlling your breathing is teaching yourself that you can consciously control your inner landscape, which is what allows you to get on a plane and feel okay. I would even suspect that it's not the box breathing per se. It's that it's not your normal passive reflexive pattern of breathing to getting on the plane. You're getting a sense of agency over your inner landscape.
Yes, absolutely.
So someone else might try getting on the plane and doing, long exhale breathing. I mean, the one thing you don't want to try is just holding your breath because eventually you'll pass out. But I think that if you want to be more alert, emphasize inhales, meaning make them longer and more vigorous. If you want to be more relaxed, rather, emphasize exhales. Make them longer, make them more vigorous relative to your inhales. And all of that makes sense by way of the relationship between breathing, the diaphragm, the heart, and what I described before of the blood flow through the heart and this respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So, we're in 2024, we're starting to get to the point where it's like, okay, a lot of the stuff that's been cloaked by complicated language in yogic traditions like Yoga Nidra is simply non-sleep deep rest. Breath work is simply changing the pattern of breathing to change your patterns of heart rate and also changing the deployment patterns of neurotransmitters in the brainstem. And so for me as a scientist, my job isn't to complicate things per se. I look at things through a slightly different lens. I have great reverence for these ancient traditions, especially since they arrived at all this stuff without any knowledge of mechanism. Like, how cool is that? And so I don't look at the yogic traditions or breath work or Wim Hof breathing or therapeutic breathing in a clinical trial as distinct from one another. My job, especially through the podcast, is to identify the common denominators, bring forward some understanding of mechanism and say, which one works? They all work. Why? For the following reasons. And maybe there are a few things that have been mentioned that are kind of conjecture that probably are like just, no. But then again, who am I to say that the intentions of Yoga Nidra aren't reprogramming the mind in the same way that medically prescribed hypnosis is rewiring the mind, because we know that happens.
I'd love to know, have you done any work into consciousness?
So I haven't. One of the problems of working on consciousness is that scientists, in particular neuroscientists, still can't agree what that means. Yeah. And it's one of these things where, we so heavily rely on operative definitions of what things are, like two laboratories focusing on the same thing. I mean, we know conscious, unconscious, like knocked out, awake. But, if I'm paying attention to my own internal landscape, interoceptive awareness versus exteroceptive awareness, both of them are a level of consciousness. What we do know is that we can split our attention. Like, I can pay attention to you and I know that there are words over there in my periphery. I can expand my gaze and look at this whole room, but I can't split my attention into like 10 places. Right? Maybe through the use of AI or something like that, we'll be able to do that. But I can't have 10 conversations at once. I might be able to flip back and forth between 10, but that's hard. And I can think about the past, the present, or the future, some combination of two of those things, past and present, present and future and past. but I can't think about all three simultaneously. We're not, I don't think anyone really can, at least not in any kind of constructive way. So we need better definition of what consciousness is. We need to separate it out from attention. And here I think it's probably just worth mentioning that sensation is the nervous system's job of taking physical stuff in our environment. So mechanical pressure, photons of light, sound waves, volatile, which simply means floating around, chemicals in the environment that we sense with our nose, and converting those physical events like photons of light into neural signals, chemical and electrical release of neurons, so that the brain can make sense of them. That's what we do. The other day here in Australia, a guy in our team went to sleep, woke up from a nap, and there was a giant, excuse my language, blanking spider and huntsman spider above his bed. And we were
Standard.
like, whoa, okay. All right. So his consciousness is completely focused on that huntsman spider, right? The huntsman spider has compound eyes and can view wavelengths. It can see wavelengths of light that we can't see. The same light is in the room. It's just that we have a cutoff at a certain range. We can't see into the infrared. Pit vipers and huntsman spiders, at least by my reading, because this is what I do. When we see a huntsman spider, go read about it, can do that. We are constantly converting certain physical events in the world into neural events. And then which neural events we pay attention to is our perception. So until a moment ago, I wasn't thinking about the contact of my hamstrings, my thighs against the chair I'm sitting on. But if I bring my attention to it, well, then my consciousness is there like a spotlight. Now, the physical sensations are always there. The pressure was there 10 minutes ago. I just wasn't perceiving it because I didn't direct that spotlight there. And the big question in consciousness is, what is controlling the spotlight? We can control that spotlight, but of course, if something very dramatic happens in the room, I'm going to immediately and unconsciously be drawn there. The spotlight will go there. So we don't quite know if there's a single brain center, or more likely there are multiple brain centers that are controlling the direction and intensity and location of these spotlights. But we know that there are probably 2 spotlights that we can merge to one location, put all our attention on the microphone, or separate to the glass in the microphone. I'm doing that right now, or to the glass and microphone in my body. We start to split our attention, but then we start to feel like we're kind of on shakier ground, right? And so much of focus and attention is about getting into that narrow trench of perception. And that's mainly done, at least in sighted people, through the visual system. In low vision or no vision people, they're mainly doing that through their hearing. And indeed, blind people have far more acute hearing than high acuity hearing and touch sensation than sighted people do. But when it comes to consciousness, it's just hard to design good experiments because we don't really know what we're looking for. So that's a long-winded way of saying I personally haven't worked on it, but I'm very interested in and have done some work on attention, although that's not the particular focus of my lab.
I've got 2 short answer questions.
Sure.
Because they're rapid enough.
Oh, yeah, I'm not known for being succinct. And that's both due to genetic mutation and upbringing. They somehow failed to silence me as a child. So,
what's the best advice that you've ever been given?
Can you give me a domain of life?
Life advice.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'll list off 2 or 3 quick ones. Know the 6 pillars of mental health, physical health, and performance, and follow them. Seriously, I wish that advice had been given to me. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I had mental or physical challenges, fortunately not major ones, en route to along my career and life and everything. And paying more attention to those things when I was younger would have probably allowed me to do much more and with much more ease and et cetera. I think in the realm of physical exercise, so there's that one. And then I'll say in the realm of physical exercise is learn to enjoy training hard. Like doing hard things is fun because I learned to enjoy it early on. Like, this is fun. Like learn that. And that includes learning. And then the last one is, I think probably Robert Greene's book, Mastery, taught me the lesson that get back into, every once in a while, touch back into the feelings that are associated with just pure delight. Because that energetic state is something that you can access again and again. And if you can do that and different contexts, you're going to have a great life. You're going to do great things for you, and you're going to engage with the right people and things in the right way. And there's no like little like quote or like tweet ism that works for that, but that's what I think people are talking about when they talk about like the spark or the essential self. Like there's nothing more valuable than being in touch with that.
And our final question, Andrew, what is a life of greatness to you?
Wow. These are hard questions. Yeah. Well, I see a life of greatness. That's a hard one. I do believe that at every stage of life, different things, including challenges, but also aspirations, bring us different sense of meaning. I guess I'm just going to. I realize now the short answer is the answer that the great Paul Conti, the psychiatrist who was a guest on the Huberman Lab podcast once on talking about trauma, and also did a series all about mental health, not just mental illness, but mental health, and is actually the one that put us in contact. So we
love Paul Conti.
We love you, Paul. We're channeling you in.
He's been on this podcast too. He's a wonderful guy.
He's a wonderful guy, and one of the most caring and clearly one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever met.
Yeah,
without question. I mean, supernatural levels of insight into the mind, and makes it ultimately distill down to simple concepts. And I think a great life, pushed through the lens of what I've learned from Paul and I respect so much, is a life where you are striving always to have agency and gratitude, a sense of control, healthy control, not control over others or even control over oneself, but being in alignment with one's, essential purpose and being generative, and gratitude, which of course is essential to being able to appreciate the fruits of one's labors, and also to be able to appreciate the small things that involve no labor whatsoever. So I think when Paul said about defining mental health as agency and ultimately agency and gratitude, and a lot of things, push forward to create agency and gratitude, I think a life of greatness is a life in which one is accessing states of agency and gratitude as often as one can. Full stop.
Andrew Huberman, your work is unbelievably inspiring. What you've done for not just Americans, for people worldwide, in providing them science in a way that they can digest has really changed the landscape. And it is such an honor to talk to you today. I understand why your podcast goes for 3 hours, because you are just an absolute juggernaut of information. So thank you so much for the conversation today. I am so grateful.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm so grateful that Paul connected us, and thank you for what you do. It's clear you have a ton of passion for it. I'm so glad that you listen to that inner voice about what you want to do, and you're a shining example of aligning with that spark and continually going back to it. Clearly, we all benefit. And this is a great honor for me, and it's been wonderful to be here in Australia. Y'all are such terrific hosts. I know you don't say y'all here, but anyway, what do they say? Well, anyway, y'all are terrific hosts, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share here today. So thank you.
Thank you.